Paul and Arun translate their Erscheinung as phenomenon in the first paragraph. And it's misleading to call, especially as what Gadamer is trying to say about death, it's not strictly speaking a phenomenon that we observe. And the other one, I don't have the German. Don, I think, did you give it there? It's on 65, it's about 15 lines down the page, what is constantly present and represents. And
Yeah.
what is it?
Vergegenwärtigung.
Gegenwärtigen, yeah.
And von dem Vergegenwärtigen. Yeah.
I wouldn't say represent.
Good.
Mm-hmm.
All right, thanks. Are there any other concerns about the translation before we jump in? Okay, well, let's jump in. We picked this, I think, because the question of death seems globally significant right now. And this was a piece that only came out a few years ago, in English at least, in the volume by Paul and Arun. And so for some people, I think it's a new piece, one they haven't read before. So that's always fun to do among Gadamer scholars. Does somebody want to start? If someone has something to think, boy, we really have to talk about this, and I can't wait to see if it comes up naturally. I just want to put it on the table at the beginning. The best way to do this is to use the raise your hand function. And that way I can, because there's 23 of us, and I can't see everybody.
Yeah.
I'm not worried about it. Thumbs up.
You see my hand? Is that the raising the hand?
That's good, Jim. That's a thumbs up, but that will count. Give you a thumbs up. Go ahead, Jim. Yeah, no, we're clapping. Applause. That's good too.
I'm searching in my reactions. So, oh, you mean in the chat? I should raise my hand?
In reactions, actually, it's called raise hand. Yeah.
All right. Well, I won't raise my hand anymore.
Okay, you don't need to anymore. You're at the floor.
No, I begin just very innocently in general, just to say, well, it really impressed me about the article is Gadamer. It's Gadamer's wisdom. It's a philosopher that really seems to have wisdom about this kind of thing. I just can't imagine someone like Heidegger writing something as sensitive and nuanced like this, even though obviously Heidegger is a very analytical thinker.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Jean, did you have your hand up?
I just wanted to show how one raises one.
Oh, yeah, it was a meta raising of your hand.
A raised hand from the thumbs up, but I'll do it again so you can see. It's just like this.
There it is.
You can lower your hand again.
And I think we have Don actually has his hand up, not just.
But since I'm talking, I'll pick up on Jim Risser's point. It is true that this piece is very different from Heidegger, but yet one constantly feels that Heidegger is behind everything Gadamer is saying. Heidegger is the one who made that the main question of our existence. And he said our only authentic existence would consist in running towards death, to fall out from zum Tode. And Gadamer says just about the opposite. We cannot do that. We cannot run towards that. We cannot even think that. And this unthinkability of that is the condition of all thinking. So I think that the dialogue with Heidegger is going to be, for us, very important, very lively, and I think it is very much in the back of Gadamer's mind, I would think.
Makes sense. Yeah, Don.
Well, I don't know if we want to pursue that line. Maybe we should. I was thinking about something else, but maybe it's more important to pursue this. So on page 69, that's where Heidegger explicitly comes into the piece. I agree that he haunts the entire piece. I mean, that theme it's important to take it up precisely because he made it important to take it up, and Gadamer responds to that. But it's when he speaks about anxiety, about angst, that Heidegger then comes in explicitly. And that passage, I think, is uh, very deep and puzzling to me. I don't know that I understand it. I might look at the bottom of 69, the sentence that says in the next to last paragraph, thus the fact that we are thinking beings seems to be the ground for the unintelligibility of death, and at the same time seems to include the knowledge of this unintelligibility. I think there's a lot to unpack there, and I really am puzzled by it. It seems a paradox on top of a paradox on top of a paradox or something. So it's very hard for me to think it. Okay. Any help anybody can give, I would appreciate.
John Arthos?
Yeah, so just to pick up on that page. So yeah, so Heidegger and being in time, anxiety is anxiety towards nothing, towards death, is sort of the axial, is sort of the pivotal structural principle that sets everything up, the structure of care and everything. And that's, as you say, absent here. I mean, this essay seems to me to be very brave, but also free of anxiety in a way, right? So I was wondering about that in relationship to Heidegger, because of course Heidegger moves on from the structure of care towards the being of language, and Gadamer follows him in that direction, right? So I was wondering what people thought about, is Gadamer following Heidegger in a different way? Is he following him as Heidegger moves beyond Dasein, in the sense that he talks about it in Being in Time, towards something else, towards some other notion of being?
Yeah, Jim, I see your hand up there.
I noticed this difference, and I thank Jean for bringing this up about the difference or the relation to Heidegger and placing it more as a point of emphasis. But we all know that when Heidegger does analyze death and being in time, it's in the general context of the general movement of how one is pulled up and out of inauthenticity. And you don't find that characterization of life in Gadamer. In fact, the way he emphasizes the idea of transcendence, which of course is also in Heidegger, but expressed here by Gadamer a different way, starts to show you that he has this, Gadamer has this great sense of the real, of being a finite creature and what exactly that means almost existentially. And so I think there is that difference from Heidegger, because the context in which Heidegger is talking about death is clearly different. I mean, in relation to authenticity and inauthenticity. My second comment is also, you see Gadamer continues to draw from Greek sources here. At a certain point, you can't miss his references to Heraclitus.
Well, can I just go back to page 69, sort of at the top of the page, maybe this picks up Jim's point. He states the following thesis. He's rethought the issue until he can formulate a thesis. And at the top of 69, he says, we have the following thesis. It belongs to the experience of thinking death that this experience constantly lags behind itself, that it grasps, as it were, a trace of death, only in thinking death away and remaining in the certainty of one's own life. How is this? What is, he says, as it were, sort of, as it were, a trace of death. What is the trace of death in thinking?
Mm-hmm. So how I understood that, and I'm looking at what he says about thinking at the end of the next paragraph and the paragraph after that, is that all thinking is always something that takes us beyond ourselves. It's always something that projects onto something bigger than us, that extends beyond, even beyond our own lives. And so in the very activity of thinking, we are transcending ourselves, but also recognizing the ways in which our thinking and what we're thinking about is going to outlast us. So there is a recognition in our thinking of also our finitude. That is, we are going to die, and these thoughts and what we're thinking about are always things that are bigger than us. That's how I thought he was expressing it there. That's what I would say is the way in which death is in his thinking. Death is, the trace of death is in his thinking.
Well,
We lost David's picture. David, are you still there? There you are. Sound. Can't hear you, David.
All right, I have to take care of something else quickly here. I got to
okay.
send John the link.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, is death itself a form of taking us away from ourselves? Is it a trace in the sense that there's a certain parallel here? That is, thinking carries us beyond ourselves. It overflows ourselves. He uses expressions like overflows, okay, transcends ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
But death also takes us away from ourselves. And so there's a trace of death in the very act of taking ourselves away from ourselves into the future, into something else.
I see. There he is.
I'll just go ahead. You didn't recognize me, David. So.
Sorry, I've been scrambling around here. John has been. John, you made it.
Thank you.
Hey. All right. Let me say something, and then I'll stop talking. In respect to the both comments on death, I mean on the trace of death, I thought it was much simpler than that. I'll pose it as a question to everyone. Isn't the trace of death simply what an ordinary trace means, the way Gadamer will talk about this and Derrida will talk about it, and Levinas for that matter? That the trace of death is that it's in our lives. We know we're going to die, but we don't know we're going to die at the same time. And the trace of death is that it's always there. It's always in our life, but there's a trace that is, it's something we don't see directly, we don't apprehend directly, so it's a trace.
Yeah, John Arthos.
Yeah, so okay, so a trace, to me, a trace is something that you see. If you look back, you see a trace on the ground. And he has this whole meditation about burial mounds and ceremonies, and he does that in many places, but he does it here. But then he does, but in relationship to overflow, which is in the German, it's on 168, and he's in that part of the essay, he's doing a more of a Neoplatonist, a Platinian sort of meditation, the sort of the Lebensquelle, and then he coins a word, Seinsüberschuss, so the transcendence of life. So to me, that's different, like the overflow, which I think they translate that as excess, but it's this Neoplatonic idea of something that goes beyond what we can conceive, because his whole premise of this is that death is inconceivable. So the Überfluss is the thing that goes beyond what we can conceive, but it's beyond that, right? But then the trace, I guess I'm asking about, it seems to me like the trace is something that you can see. It's some sense that you have when you look back and you see traces of death somehow.
Oh, sorry. Greg.
Yeah, I think I agree with what Jim said about this. Maybe just to put what I took to be his point in a slightly different way. I take it that a trace is something that we can experience kind of only indirectly, only in virtue of something else that isn't it. And so the idea is we never experience death itself, right? Because of course, when we're dead, we're not there to experience it, but we experience kind of this like, limit or horizon to anything that we can conceive or experience. So the trace of death, the kind of, limit that this prescribes around our thinking is always there, even though death itself is never present to us.
So you want to, so I guess the question I thought Don was asking, and that I'm curious about too, is this quote on 69, where it says, the fact that we are thinking beings seems to be the ground for the unintelligibility of death. So death is unintelligible to us because we're thinking beings in ways that's not unintelligible to non-thinking beings. And at the same time seems to include the knowledge of this unintelligibility. So Greg, you want to say includes the knowledge because thinking always has limits, and we always recognize the limits of our thinking?
Well, and I think I'm more specifically to that point. I think the idea is that thinking, as he's spelling it out here, is a kind of self-transcendence, right? Where myself is going beyond itself. And that means, on the one hand, that death is unintelligible, right? Because even as I'm transcending myself, it's still me that's transcending myself. And so I can't think a situation in which I'm not. But at the same time, precisely because thought is myself transcending myself, I can become aware of my own limits. I'm not just kind of like contained, unawares within those. So that transcendence is at the same time what allows me to recognize the fact that I'm never going to be able to think death. That's kind of how I took that part of it.
Yeah, John.
Yeah, to me, that what Greg just said is his ultimate conclusion, because what I read him to be doing at the very end of the essay was to say exactly that. It's his main theme of Socratic wisdom, right? Socratic ignorance, right? As wisdom, we know that we don't know. So to read that last seems to me to spread, if I can read this, seems at times to spread a wee bit more brightness than that of the quietly burning candle. The unintelligibility of death is the highest triumph of life. So the thing that distinguishes human knowledge, human wisdom, is human ignorance. The fact that we know that we don't know. That, to me, that was the ultimate conclusion that he came to about human beings' relationship to death.
Jean.
Yes, well, my point here is that I think what Gadamer is actually saying is that when we think, we project ourselves in the future, whatever we think, and in this projection into the future, there is a certain forgetfulness of death. And I think the main point of Gadamer's thinking on death, not only in this piece, but also in other pieces, is that it is essential for human beings that they forget about death to a large degree. This is a thesis he first put forward in his piece of the 40s on Prometheus and the tragedy of culture. I don't know if a few of you will be familiar with this great text of Heidegger, written in 44 and presented by Gadamer in Dresden, of all places, in 1944, and where Gadamer says that what Prometheus brought to the humans, according to Aeschylus, was not culture, was not fire, was not the arts. It was the forgetfulness of fatality, the forgetfulness that they have to die one day. And he says this is the tragedy of culture. This is the title of his piece in 1946. It was written in 1944. Culture is based on a tragedy because it's based on a forgetfulness of death. And this is a piece Gadamer published immediately after the war in Die Wandlung, in the journal edited by Karl Jaspers. And I see this thinking coming up again in this piece of 1972 that he gave in answer to some students in Heidelberg. And he came back to this idea of Prometheus. But I think it's important for Gadamer that we forget about that. We forget about our mortality. Because life and thinking would not be possible if we would be constantly thinking about our mortality and facing our mortality head on, as Heidegger expected of Dasein. So this is why I see Gadamer's writing as a bit of a plaidoyer for forgetfulness of death. And his entire philosophy. I mean, it is perhaps no coincidence that Gadamer does not have much to say about death in Truth and Method, compared to, say, Heidegger.
Mhm.
For Heidegger, it is a major chapter, the first chapter of the second part of Begin Time. And Gadamer could write Truth and Method with its basic optimism, with quotes. And it's not a philosophy of death, it's a philosophy of life. And here I would be thinking about the nice obituary that Derrida published about Gadamer a few weeks after he died. He says, I cannot believe that Gadamer has died because this man was an affirmation of life in the way he lived, in the way he taught. So I would say that Gadamer's basic idea in this text is that the affirmation of life presupposes that we forget about death, about fatality. Sorry, I talked for too long.
No, that's good. Yes, Eric.
I wanted to change directions just a little bit. I mean, it's connected with what John was just saying, but so the title is Death as a Question, and he's kind of, you know, by the end, in talking about the unintelligibility of death, but death as a trace, these sorts of things, is death a question? Like, is there a question we can ask about death? If it is genuinely unintelligible, then, you know, like in our forgetfulness of death, we can ask questions about specific other topics. Like in our self-forgetfulness about death, I can now ask a question about being toward the text, like with what John was just saying, that in Truth and Method, Gadamer is talking about being toward the text rather than being towards death. And so I guess by the end of the article, I'm not sure whether there's a question about death, right? That is death a topic about which I can ask questions? Like I noticed that Nancy earlier put in talking about palliative care and grief, right? Like we can start asking questions in the context of specific kinds of dying, but to make, I don't know who said it earlier, maybe it was Don, death itself, right, as a subject matter about which we can ask questions seems to like be undermined by the reflection here.
Yes, Niall.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to Jean's point actually, because you know, the way we read texts say perhaps more about ourselves than very often than the authors we're reading. But I kind of have to disagree, because as I read this text, I thought it was kind of a piece with both the spirit and letter of a Heideggerian phenomenology of death. Specifically, I think what he's trying to do in those last two pages, 69 and 70, is to think the otherness of death. So the theme of the other is present in the text, but I think this is a kind of the meontology of death, right? So why is it so difficult to think about death? Well, because thinking is so constantly or continually focused on meaning and making sense of something, but death marks the limit of the unintelligibility. So there is no space to make sense of something. So I think what he's trying to do, however, is not forget it in terms of building on a kind of a continuity and forgetting. He's asking for us, and it's very Heideggerian, I think he's asking for us to not to conceal the unintelligibility of death from ourselves, which amounts to holding the unintelligibility of death before ourselves. So now that smacks of almost a kind of a type of resoluteness in that moment. It may not have the voluntarism that sometimes creeps in with Heidegger, but I went and I checked. There is that lecture Heidegger gave on Aristotle in 1939 in the Physica Beta, and the one of the last lines is almost identical with Gadamer's last line. Heidegger writes, he says, death is the highest act of living. And he does that in the analysis of kinesis and steresis in Aristotle. So he wants to think, how can movement and repose be thought together, not as something that excludes one another, but as a kind of a unitary phenomenon. And I think that whole idea of the unintelligibility of death as the highest triumph of life is almost a translation of death is the highest act of living. There is both kinesis, there is steresis in kinesis, and kinesis in steresis, which he claims Plato wouldn't accept, what Aristotle did. So I think in some way it's about thinking the otherness of death as a kind of a meontology. And that brings us back full circle to Jim's point about the translation question, the difference between the appearance of something or the phenomenon of something. So can death be a phenomenon, or can it be an appearance? Is it something that makes itself felt, or is there a different way of talking about it? So that was how I read that.
Now, just for clarification, to what end though? Like, why are both of these folks? I mean, like from Heidegger, right? Like, obviously, sorry, I'm trying to lower my hand too, David. I'll do it. You know, like for Heidegger, right? Anxiety about death is what individuates you from the they self, right? To be authentic. But I don't hear Gadamer trying to say the only way to be authentic is to keep the unintelligibility of death before your mind at all times, or else you're not really living your life, right? It's okay to forget about death so that you can live your life instead of keeping it present to your mind. I don't know.
Yeah, obviously I don't think he's talking about something you've got to walk around all the time and that's the only authenticity. You've got to hold it in front of yourself. I think in a philosophical act, however, is one in which death is reflected on and brought in front of oneself as something that is not necessarily intelligible in the usual sense. So yeah, okay. Others want to come in.
Don. Don, you there? I can't.
I'm sorry. Jim had his hand up first, so I think we should hear from him first.
I just wanted to answer Eric's question. I think it's not a question of authenticity or inauthenticity, but Jean was already saying it. It's about Socratic humility and what it means to know. When Socrates says he knows that he doesn't know, that's almost a bad translation of the idea. It's not, excuse me, that he knows nothing. That's a bad translation of the idea. And knowing that you don't know, well, isn't holding the unintelligibility of death before one, what Niall was saying, isn't that the experience of Socratic humility? So what is the purpose of that? Well, the same purpose you would say Socrates' practice of humility in the context, and this is not Socrates' word, the context of human finitude. But that's not necessarily a question of authenticity, inauthenticity. And I would only add to that, I think the way Gadamer so eloquently explains anamnesis adds to also how Niall started this leg of the conversation. I think that shows that element of Socratic, that's a way of re-expressing the Socratic humility that Gadamer adopts. So at one point, maybe we can turn back to page 62, not now, wherever the conversation is going, let's pursue that. But a footnote then to go back to see how he does talk about anamnesis.
Good. Sorry, I didn't see your hand, Jim. Don.
No, I think that's very, very helpful indeed. I just note at the end on 69, the connection he makes is between the direction he goes is to the freedom of thinking. Mm-hmm. And this freedom is something that can't be turned away from. It's not a matter of choice. It's not holding in front of your mind as though you could decide to do that or not do that. It is a necessary unintelligibility of death. And that necessary unintelligibility is only because death is unintelligible and is seen as unintelligible that you can think, and that you can think freely, where freedom doesn't mean choice. Freedom means, well, what does freedom mean? What is it? What is the freedom of thinking that is not a matter of choice, but that depends on the necessary unintelligibility of death?
What, liberation from prejudices, something like that?
Could be, I'm hoping you can help me out. What is that?
Yeah, no, good question. Greg?
Yeah, I was just going to say, going back to Nathan's question, it strikes me that both for Gadamer and for Heidegger, thinking about death isn't as much a matter of what we're thinking about, right? Am I thinking about the fact that I'm going to die right now, as opposed to, thinking about politics or sports or my hobbies or whatever? It's a matter of how we're thinking about whatever it is that we think about. So even if what I'm thinking about is politics and trying to decide who I'm going to vote for, there's a way of thinking about that and doing that deliberation that kind of recognizes the fact that I'm going to die, the fact that I'm limited. And there's a way of doing that fails to recognize the fact that I'm going to die and I'm limited. And so I think that the holding death in front of us is not a matter of just walking around all day like I'm going to die. It's thinking about whatever we're thinking about in an appropriate sort of way.
Yeah, I like that. That connects with the humility too, I think. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I wasn't unmuted there. Go ahead, Sean.
Yes, it is to Don Marshall's question about what is freedom. Well, Gadamer says it on page 69, and maybe we can have a look at his text just before his piece where he says the thesis is now the following. The paragraph before that, he tells us what is thinking, and thinking is related, as we will see, to taking a distance. So about 6 lines, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines from the thesis is now the following on page 69. The German is, of course, better, but for what is thinking? By the way, a question Heidegger also asked. It is taking a distance, Abstandnahme, which is very important. Abstandnahme, it is being extirpated from the instinctive process of natural life. Es ist herausgelöst sein aus den Instinktzügen des natürlichen Lebens. This is what freedom is, to be extirpated or extricated or freed from the instincts of a human life. This is why we can project ourselves in the future. And to project oneself into the future is to be free. We are not limited to the here and now. We're not limited to the or what our instincts dictate us we should do. And so Gadamer here sees a very precise connection between freedom, between thinking, and, as I would put it, forgetfulness of death. We can project ourselves in the future. We don't have to think about that all the time.
And thinking is always that sort of projection into the future. Is that right?
Es ist Abstandnahme.
Yeah.
How did they translate it? It is taking a distance.
Is that why on the page before he says, thinking death already seems to transform death into something it is not? He's talking about the impossibility of thinking death, and it's specifically about what we do when we think makes it impossible for death to be. Would you say that is the reason why death is always missed when we think?
Well, I would have to find the passage.
Okay.
and see the German, because I'm not very familiar with the English. I'm sorry.
Okay, it's on in English. It's on page 65.
65. Let's
He
look
talks
at
about a
that.
methodological consideration.
Okay.
He talks about, does it make sense to say we ask the question of what death is seriously? Does it make sense to say we ask it seriously? Is it not in the end rather fatal for this question? This goes back to what Eric was asking about, that it remains tied to the certainty human beings have of being alive. Must the thought of death thereby not contain an ultimate existential lack of seriousness, because this thought must be endured by the living? So we can't really seriously ask this question as long as we're alive. A thought about death that allows us to continue to live does not seem to be much different and not essentially distinguishable from all of our other dreams of our life, which we dream and in which we are caught as long as we live. Did I miss a sentence? Okay. It seems we have here an antagonism in which death and thought exclude each other and are held separate. Thinking death always seems to transform death into something it is not. Perhaps, I'll skip a sentence, perhaps the question, what is death, is not only problematic, but is also at the same time, and in a certain sense, the answer to the question itself, because it renders the answer questionable. Yeah. All right. Niall.
I wanted to just say, I think it's really that point about freedom as distance taking is really central. But there's a kind of, he's playing on words, I think, at least the English comes across that way. To take a distance from something also includes taking a distance from oneself, right? So there's a kind of a self-distanciation at work, but then the line reads that self-distanciation would also be to think myself away, which is connected to death, right? To think away from myself is not the same as to think myself away. So both my own non-existence is part of my own distance taking. So there's taking a distance from a state of affairs or from my experiences. There's a distance taking from my own self-interests, which is already a kind of a Kantian theme coming in. And then there is to think myself away. So there would be three, at least discrete ways of reading the distance.
Roger, did you want to get in here? You had your hand up until a second ago.
Well, I'm not sure what to really add at this point. I was thinking a little bit about Arendt and what Arendt says about thinking,
Mm-hmm.
and thinking about that in connection with Gadamer, and I mean, I think I agree with Jean that really what this is an fact that death in a sense is unthinkable. Ultimately, it's an affirmation of living. And so I do agree with that point. But I wonder, and this is sort of a question for Jean that maybe I could ask. I mean, when Gadamer is talking about this freedom, in a sense, it's a necessary freedom because we always live in the logos. And for human beings, that's inescapable. And I think because we live in logos, death ultimately is that which we can't think away, but it's only because we think that we can't think it away. I just say a quick anecdote. When my older daughter was about 4, I remember walking around the street, a little store on the corner where we lived in Canada. And she looked up at me and out of the blue said, "It's hard to imagine being dead." And that sort of came back to me when I was when I was actually reading this piece. So I'll just leave it at that for the moment.
Yeah, that's great. Yep. Jay, welcome.
Thank you. John put me onto this. I hope you don't mind me dropping in, David. Good to see you.
Yeah.
I'm going to go in a little bit of a different direction, and we may want to cut this off right away. I was intrigued at the very beginning of the article that Gadamer wrote about the cult of the graves and the practices and the rituals that a community engages in. And he said, is this the answer to the question of death? Or is it trying to hide from the question of death? And I suppose implicitly he might answer it that, oh, that's just hiding from the question of death, because he drops that it doesn't carry forward. I think, especially thinking of the pandemic, right? It's horrifying that so many people are dying, but it's also horrifying that we can't engage in our usual rituals, right? Something that's very disturbed. And I wonder if others felt death is unthinkable, but that doesn't mean we can't engage in rituals that bring death into life and life into death. And I'm just surprised that Gadamer didn't say more about that in this short essay.
Yeah, thanks. Greg is on this question.
Yeah, I was just going to say, maybe this was me misreading or just idiosyncratic to me. I took it that kind of the point he was getting to at the end of the essay is that no, these these various cults of the grave and things are not merely attempts to hide from death. That there's something more positive going on in those, precisely because death isn't something that we can face directly. We can only encounter it indirectly. That he was trying to say that these various cults of the grave are legitimate and helpful ways of engaging in the sort of thinking about death or relating to death that we can. So I took it to be a kind of positive take on those things by the end of the essay, at least.
Okay. Don is on this as well. Don?
Oh,
Oh,
Can
are you
Go ahead,
saying
John.
John or Don?
no, I said
Oh,
Don.
John. You said John. You said John? John.
I said Don, but we haven't heard
Oh.
from John yet. So let's let John get in here.
Let's
And
let
then you
John
can
get
be next, Don. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. And this is just it's a wonderful conversation. I'm sorry I missed the first of it, but I saw here a theme that runs through this, and begins on the very second paragraph, knowing the known. And of course, as was mentioned, there's anamnesis, and he talks about the Phaedo. And it's interesting. In 1975, I was taking a course with Gadamer on the Phaedo, and I was just reading through the transcript coincidentally, and the basically, when I think it's Kebes who says, well, there's some kind of child in us that who will not. There's no way you can erase the fear of the unknown, of death. And Gadamer sort of says, well, that's the last word. That's the final word we can say about what we know about death. And except, of course, with Christianity and so on, the overcoming of death with the cross and so on, the triumph over death. Of course, that's a religious thing. But when it comes to philosophy, that's a box we're never going to open. But at the same time, it's Gadamer is finding a way to open it in a triumphant way that sort of says, how could we know? How could life be our honor, be our glory if it wasn't for death? So I think it's a very it's a great essay.
Yeah, good. Thanks, John. Okay, Don.
I think that's very helpful because I think there's a certain coherence between the comment on grave offerings, the Phaedo. I think that's connected, but I think the essay is bracketed because on the one hand, there's that, all of the ways in which we affirm life in the face of death, and sort of our riposte to death is that we're not going to accept it. It's a protest against it. And that poem he quotes from Celan at the end, which is about the Holocaust and the unthinkability. What he says about it is that knowledge by which death would become conceivable and bearable should never be presumed. A really extraordinary sentence, I think. But I think that's the force of, there is no consolation, there is no answer, there is no riposte to death. And that's part of what Celan is saying. There is no consolation. It is absolute and devastating And it is irrecoverable from that devastation. That's the point of that poem by Celan. So I think it's very Gadamerian to have both ends of the issue. The attempt to conceal death and the unconcealability of the absolute nothingness of death in Celan's poem, okay, where God is praying to us instead of us praying to God. There you go.
Yeah, great, great. So I'm hoping that Nancy, I'm hoping you and maybe some others who regularly interact with death might share with us how what Gadamer says about death fits with your experiences of people who are not calling on you right now. I'm just saying I hope that in this conversation you feel.
Absolutely. David, thank you for that comment. I'd actually, and I don't mean to put my poor PhD student on the spot, but Kate Wong is with us, and she actually works in a children's hospice. And she's been writing me separate texts and comments about her experience of, and I was really curious around her read of this and what Gadamer was saying about children's perception of death. So I don't know if you wanted the conversation to go in that direction now or leave it.
Well, I don't want to force Kate to talk right now. She doesn't feel like it, but I'm hoping she will feel like sharing with us what she's been sharing with you and her own experiences when she's up for it.
I can try to be brave in front of a very prestigious group of philosophers and share what I was talking with Nancy about. But on page 63, when Gadamer writes, there's a child in human beings that does not yet feel reassured by all these proofs of immortality. I was thinking in my experience, whether children know explicitly that they're dying or not, there's always this uncertainty that they'll live and an anxiety around that because their parents can't give them a definitive answer about what death is. And I was also thinking that it's maybe so sad that children die because they're the epitome of being animated.
Right. Good point. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. I thought I saw. Oh yeah, Eric, is that a hand up there?
Yeah, I did have a hand up on a different topic, but Kate, I wanted to ask a more clarifying question with what you were just saying, if I can. So you were highlighting that sentence from Gadamer about the child not being reassured. And so like when you're saying that the parents can't give the child an answer, are you seeing the children in an anxious state asking the parents for an answer? Or are the kids in their animation not really thinking about the question? And it's the parents that are kind of the ones who are behind closed doors, like the anxious ones.
I think it depends on the child and their sort of developmental understanding of death. And I think with my thesis topic, I'm always interested in how children experience dying, because if you understand something differently, would you experience it differently? So it depends on how the child understands death, their religious background and that kind of thing as well. But I find even in situations where it's not been disclosed to the child that they are actually dying, they always know. So I think there's an underlying anxiety about, is this something that's okay to talk about? Is it okay to ask what's going to happen to me? Or is that going to upset my family? So I think it's anxiety for everybody in those situations. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. Do we want to look more? I mean, we got all sorts of hands just popped up on me. John, Arthos.
Yeah, so I think there's another interlocutor here who's very important, maybe even the most important in this conversation that he's having about death, which is who is Goethe. And it comes up in the context of, death as a question and providing answers, because he thinks, he says that providing answers about death is fundamentally unserious, is the language he uses. So I wanted to point out that he brings Goethe up at the beginning and in the end of his meditation. So at the beginning, he says on page 64 in the English, he says, Goethe is sort of bringing love and death together, and he says, and he accuses Goethe. He says, this is not an attempt to take death entirely seriously. And so that is a reference to a poem that Goethe wrote. And I actually wanted to share that poem because I looked it up. Can I share my screen?
I may have to give you permission to. Wait, let me give it a try. Let me see. Does it say share screen? Does it let you?
Let me see. Not yet.
Okay, let me see what I can do here. How if I do this? Now do you have the ability to share screen?
Yeah, I can.
All right, go for it.
So I have the English and the German. And Goethe uses this metaphor of a candle burning, which Gadamer picks up on. He picks up on this illusion, and he uses it also at the end of the essay, right? So, but the part that he quotes here or paraphrases is, "So long as you haven't experienced this, to die, and so to grow or become," right? And so I'll stop my sharing now. But although I'll point out that this person who translates the poem says that the original poem that Goethe wrote the poem about is a Persian poet whose version likewise has a burning candle and the line, "The soul burns like the candle." So that metaphor is introduced into Gadamer's meditations. And then at the and so that's the fundamentally unserious part, because Goethe sort of has more of a Buddhist interpretation of death, as we continue. Goethe doesn't want to believe in death, as what Gadamer's saying. But then at the end, towards the end, Gadamer makes a reference to another conversation that Goethe has, which is reported about at the funeral of his friend Wieland. And on the day of his funeral in 1813, Goethe told Falk, he says the following: "I am sure that I, such as you see me here, have lived 1,000 times, and I hope to come again another 1,000 times." So Goethe has this very hopeful idea about life having a way to overcome death, this more almost a romantic idea. And what Gadamer says about that is he's less critical at that point. So he says, Goethe discusses why he can't conceive of life coming completely to an end at death. Nature would be obligated to grant us new possibilities for our excess of being. And what Gadamer says there is, I will not venture to decide how much seriousness and how much play there is in Goethe's conversation. So then, if you skip to the end of Gadamer's essay, he comes back to that metaphor of the candle, of the burning candle. And what he says there, and this is again in the very last paragraph of his essay, Gadamer's essay, he said he talks about the flickering candle, and he uses that he sort of reanimates the famous metaphor of flickering right here. So in Truth and Method, it's about the flickering, the flickering of an electrical circuit. But here, it's the flickering of the candle, and it's so it is precisely the very flickering of the candle light that he's interested in. Seems at times to spread a wee bit more brightness than that of the quietly burning candle. The unintelligibility of death is the highest triumph of life. So this is connecting back to his own meditations in Truth and Method. So he seems to be questioning whether Goethe is really is introducing a fundamentally unserious thought by trying to attempt an answer to death, which is his fundamental optimism that life cannot allow death, in this sort of Buddhist meditation.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks, John. Eric?
If people want to riff on what John was talking about first, Jim, I saw that your hand came up. If you want to riff on what John was saying, we can stick with that topic because my topic is going a totally different direction.
Yes, I'd like to stay with what John was saying just for a moment then. I'm not sure about your reading, John, but I'm willing to still be convinced because I thought it was part of this play. When I mentioned Heraclitus in my remarks earlier, it's the very next paragraph that I thought is where I saw the Heraclitus. And I thought the Goethe reference was in the context of what I see as the Heraclitus, about sleeping and dreaming, about being asleep and being awake. That's the Heraclitus reference. And also that idea of the light, not just the flickering, but the light. That's how Gadamer closes, and Jean knows this quite well, the end of his essay, Towards a Phenomenology of Ritual and Language. And that's a quote from Heraclitus. So it's the human in the silent night lights a light himself. That's Gadamer closing his essay with a quote from Heraclitus. So my question back to you, I'm wondering, is the question of the candle not about this, the light of life and its relation to its end, and about then ultimately the movement, the flickering, about, now I'm going too far with the idea of flickering. But this relation between the darkness and the light, and the way that human lives in the light in the way of human finitude, which is always in this transition that we cannot really articulate between just as sleeping and waking, and death and life. I'm not sure if I have a question there, so I apologize.
No, it's a good point. I've never read this essay, but Gadamer does have an essay on Goethe and Heraclitus together. Goethe and Heraclitus. So maybe we don't have to choose. John, did you want to say anything about that?
Well, just just the reference, his own allusion to his own metaphor, right? Because to me, sort of there's a fundamental modesty in Gadamer. And so why he distances himself from, the mindness and subjectivity, and moves towards language and culture and tradition, is because he places less emphasis on the individual. So when he says in Truth and Method, the self-awareness of the individual is only a flickering in the closed circuits of historical life, he's sort of demoting the individual, right? And so to me, that's how I'm reading it, right? That I'm reading this, he is less interested in the survival of the individual and more interested in the survival of life as it lives in tradition.
Okay, Eric. Where'd you go? Where are you?
Yeah, we're back and forth with the hand raising.
All right, you do it. You do it.
Yeah. So can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to complain about Gadamer for a minute. So at the very beginning, he says, the upshot of human reflections on the phenomenon of death, they're found within our tradition, period, as if there's one tradition. In this enterprise, I am compelled by necessity to confine my considerations to the Greek Christian tradition, because I know the original testimony, insofar as they are linguistic form only through translations, as if we can only access discussions about death in original works and not through translations. But then by the next page, he's talking about Islamic burials, right? He clearly doesn't know Arabic. I mean, maybe he does know a little bit of Arabic. He starts talking about Vikings and Oslo. Does he know Old Norse? Right? Like, why does he make this statement at the beginning about, like, you can really only understand something if you know the original language? Because I guess I see that. Yeah, he talks about East Asian cultures on 61, right? Like, there's this, I don't know. I was reading arguments about this in the philosophy of Confucianism, where people are talking about like, is it a lack of expertise to not have original language skills in the study of Confucianism or not, right? And that there's some discussion going on about original language knowledge and stuff like this. And so I was just kind of shocked to hear him say that and then feel comfortable mentioning these things. He's like, I'm going to confine it to just Judeo-Christian or just Greco-Christian. Anyway, I got frustrated with him.
Fair enough. Does someone want to speak to that before we go on to something else?
Yeah.
Yeah, Don, go ahead.
I would. Okay. I take it as a profession of humility. I mean, he doesn't know about these things, so he's not going to talk about them, and I think that's to his credit. When it comes to the Islamic burial things, he's not talking about a text, and so he's not talking about language. He's talking about objects that he can see, and that's different. I think he wouldn't put them on the same. He wouldn't treat them the same. But in any case, he stands back. He does not claim to speak for everything in the world. There could be a completely different perspective on this from another culture. I think he allows that. It could be completely different from a different culture if you knew Chinese. Okay, so that was just my way of taking it. Okay.
John Beach, was your comment on this as well? I'm not sure you heard me. John, did you hear me?
Sorry, there we go.
Okay.
That Gadamer is like we are in a conceptual linguistic tradition that has not only what we know but what we don't know, and that what we don't know determines and has an effect on what we do know. But we can't get out of the fact that we are Cartesian subjectivists. We can't eradicate that. And so he is just acknowledging that. He is saying, okay, here's where I stand, and that's where I can speak. I'm not speaking for other different, cultures or understandings and linguistic, like, like Chinese will never be like Western languages. They'll always be different in a way. So, I mean, that's what I was going to add. In fairness to Gadamer, maybe.
Okay, good, thanks. William, do you want to take us in a different direction or build on this?
Sure. Yeah, I was wanting to go up to page 62 and 63, where he makes a distinction between Zoe and bios, and specifically the transfer over to the more particular way of living in with self-knowledge through bios. And I'm just going to read, it's about halfway down the first paragraph on page 63. He says, the attempt at thinking that is initiated here puts the knowledge about one's own life and one's own death above the universality of being animated, to which perhaps being dead really belong as its other side. Now, the problem is that the other side, the properly not being, is ungraspable for such a conscious life. In the next paragraph, he goes on to say, one could follow this history right up to the concepts of Platonic and Aristotelian philosophy. One could show how the interpretation of being animated on the basis of this self-knowledge eventually becomes the doctrine of ideas, or the doctrine of new, which is constantly present and represents. And I was kind of interested in just like if anybody had ideas about this, like, because Gadamer doesn't go on to show how like the doctrine ideas comes out of this, and if anyone had any thoughts there.
Yeah, there's a good point there about how he understands Platonic and Aristotelian philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
I have something to say in response to that. It makes me, I forget where I was reading it. It was recently, where Gadamer's saying the very kind of Platonism, right? Where Gadamer says like Plato was the first anti-Platonist, and this idea of the forms as distinct things like chairness or treeness or whatever. that distortion that kind of analytic philosophers will do to kind of straw man Plato. I think that he said something like the entire system is always relevant in this kind of unfolding of dialogues. But I'm not sure where I read that recently, but he says, like, if one form is being discussed, it's the whole apparatus that's going on.
William, I'm just don't really know why you would have to have being animated on the basis of self-knowledge eventually becomes a doctrine of ideas or a doctrine of
yeah.
Right.
That's what I was. It didn't seem like obvious, so I wish he had actually done it. What he said he could do.
Right. Yeah. But maybe Abdullah, do you have a? Oh wait, John Beach, you're next. I'm sorry, John Beach.
Yeah, I think he's talking about he's continuing to talk about the concept of suke, which Plato really developed for the first time in bringing together life, bringing together Zoa and intelligence and nous. And I think that that's what he's getting at, because nous is sort of there's a certain reflectivity in nous, but it's not consciousness as we understand it in the modern world. But I think that that's what he means by self-animation. Is the suke is the concept of self-movement, the beginning of movement and life, and it's the beginning of movement in the universe and in the soul. And I don't know if that am I answering that question at all?
Yeah, to me, it's good to come in from different angles. I'm not sure in that sense. Like what he seems to be bringing up there. He's focusing on what's constantly present and represents. And he says, like, just as the brightness of day makes our visible world possible in all its colorfulness, so by means of this inner clarity, all being receives its articulation in thinking that represents in consciousness. So there's something that, I mean, he's I guess because of the way our self-knowledge or self-consciousness is, it leads to the ideas in some sense, or new. I'm not sure. That's why I'm trying to think through it here.
Yeah, I would just say that for Gadamer, he doesn't use the word self-consciousness. He uses the word consciousness. It's very important.
Yeah.
And Heidegger didn't like that, even to use the word consciousness. But for Gadamer, there was a form of, we have to use consciousness to talk about the Greeks, but not self-consciousness.
Yeah, so he was using self-knowledge in the paper. I should have said that. Yeah.
Abdullah, do you have thoughts on this?
Maybe I might raise a question about embodiment. He mentions only once the word embodied while distinguishing Zoe and bios. But in our thinking about that, embodiment is also highly important. Not only the decay of the body, I'm not talking about here. I was thinking about touching the ill person on her deathbed, and then she dies, and our touch to this person completely changes. But because it's not responsive, it's no longer responsive to us. But Gadamer doesn't mention anything at all about embodiment or the decay of the body, or our thinking about this question of embodiment or the relationship between the body and death. I don't know why, but he's not really good on the question of embodiment at all.
No, fair enough. I think that's right.
Can I return to the Yes, it's a good comment. If I can return to the question of the passage, though, couple comments. One, the distinction between Zoe and Bios, the way Gadamer presents it here, is seemingly a shades away from the way it's in the present discourse with people such as Agamben and others, so that Bios is typically taken as political life, and Gadamer doesn't do that right here. But what he does say then about Bios rather than Zoe is about the movement towards apprehension and knowledge. And in that context, he just makes a general statement, I think, about the Western tradition. So by virtue of being bios, there is now a taking up, a self-awareness and a taking up of life and looking out at life and taking hold of it. And that's the movement, you could say, of Western philosophy and Western metaphysics. So he says, that's why I think he says, where does he first mention Plato and Aristotle, right? Where David Vesey was leaving us. I lost the passage.
On 63.
But, oh yeah, right there. It's the passage. One could show how the interpretation of being animated on the basis of self-knowledge eventually becomes the doctrine of ideas or the doctrine of nous. Let me stop there. In other words, it's what we do when we apprehend through thinking. So thinking brings to light, that makes manifest the manner of things, but not just by pointing out like perception does, that thing over there, but the what of things. And rather than characterizing just the language of essence, what he says is, so we're constantly making present. Now that's the way of describing what later comes to be called by Heidegger and Derrida the metaphysics of presence. The metaphysics of presence, simply a way of apprehending the world as a constant presence. And then I think he moves on from there, coming back to the question of death. So that's how I interpret that passage. But that's why I pointed out, we first began about the mistranslation of representation there. Representation doesn't make any sense in this context.
And I think because we know where the article goes, it's not surprising that thinking appears here at this point, right? Thinking is going to be what is the mark of life, which makes death unintelligible.
You could have put a dash after the RE for representation rather than represent.
Because it would reflect the German more closely, right? Yeah. John.
Okay, if I didn't forget it here, the good points all. I think there's just a conversation. Actually, you know what? I think I forgot what I was going to say. I'll pass. I was listening to all these good points that were made after. Sorry about that.
I'm sure we'll get back to you. Niall?
Okay.
I wanted to get a general sense of this. I agree with Jim, what he was saying there about bios, but then he does say that bios is really expressed by how I distinguish myself from other things. So that could be taken in a kind of a Agamben political way, right? It's in every way, how do I stand out from? So there is this kind of epistemological emergence of knowing and self-knowing, but then there's also how do I distinguish myself? Almost an Arendtian flavor creeping in there between how do I stand out as a persona in the world. But I was a bit more confused about the Zoe distinction. I reread this passage a few times, and I don't know what he means by it. Is it bare nature? Does he mean, is Zoe just his understanding of bare nature without an individuating principle? Because it's individuation which emerges with bios, right? Even for an animal. So even animals have individuation. They have some form of a who, perhaps. But what exactly Lebendigkeit means for him, I found that hard to make sense of. Is there any anybody can help me out.
I think you answered your own question in a way. I think it's the being alive of life, period. So it's bare life in a way. And what you said about Zoe, I think is really astute, bringing the reference to Arendt, because that's precisely what goes on in political life, is the coming to as the exercise of freedom and seeing oneself in the world.
Mm-hmm.
William.
Yeah, I was just wanting to return to Jim's point there. It makes sense. Like, that's how I was reading it too. It's almost like he's saying that this is the precursor to the metaphysics of presence, which isn't something he's normally, wanting to emphasize with respect to Plato. So this makes me think again, like this whole paper has a bit of Heideggerian flavor, and maybe this is one aspect of that. So I don't know if anyone has any comments on that.
Yes, I do.
Go, John.
Okay. Yes, I think that Gadamer, if I may, I'd be interested in feedback on this if anybody bothers, but Gadamer does see how Heidegger did see the presence. He called it the superficiality of Greeks. And this was his idea of aletheia, like it was revealed, and this was a superficial idea of truth. But then Heidegger seems to ignore, I think, what negates all of that is Plato's idea of anamnesis. And for one thing, and I think that the there is a meta, there is something to what Heidegger said, but I think Gadamer goes behind this with Plato, and that it isn't this superficiality that Heidegger criticized with as a metaphysics of presence. That's there.
Yeah, and I agree with that, and that's why it was just to me a little surprising how it was presented in this paper, because it certainly didn't seem to bring that side of it out that you're pointing to.
Well, I think that there's a theme. That theme does. I do see that theme right from the page one when he talks about knowing the known, but we don't know the known, and that death is an example of that limit that we will never know. And I mean, that was realized in Plato's Phaedo. We'll never get beyond that. So I think but yet there's a way in which its presence is known, and in which Gadamer sort of makes it into a positive thing, that kind of depth so I think there is that, that sort of hiddenness. I mean, there's always that in Gadamer. I mean, that's the whole thing about where it comes to Geschichte, is there's always a hiddenness.
Okay. Eric.
I wanted to add to the question about presence and presentism, that there's this, like, I always think of him as talking about making present in the sense of, like, the game is made present through the players in play, or that which we are talking about is made present before us in dialogue, right? He has that phrase where it's like interpretive concepts. The function of interpretive concepts is to disappear behind that which is made present in dialogue. So the kind of presence I hear him talking about is like virtuality, not presence in the kind of substance metaphysics that I think is the real target of what Heidegger and Derrida are concerned about, right? Like substance metaphysics versus, I'm thinking of process metaphysics of like Theravada Buddhism or something like this, that it's not metaphysics as such, it's substance metaphysics.
Good. So it's been brought up really from the beginning about how Heideggerian Gadamer's themes are here. Are there points here where you see him really moving away from Heidegger? You say, well, this really is a distinctively Gadamer point. This is not the sort of move Heidegger would make, other than, I mean, we opened talking about how the style of it is much more of a Gadamerian wisdom and maybe Gadamerian humility than you find in Heidegger. That's something I'm wondering if people have ideas about that.
Well, I liked what folks were saying earlier when I brought up the question of authenticity. I was just teaching the death section of Being Toward Death section of Being in Time to some undergrads. And I had just read the article and I was thinking about how to pose that. And then earlier people brought up, to think of Gadamer as promoting humility, whereas Heidegger is the one that's kind of emphasizing this. I'm thinking the jargon of authenticity, I'm trying to use authenticity in quotation marks because I think it's Funkenstein that said, when we think about authenticity in the context of the Holocaust, that reinscribes this hierarchy of humanity where, some people deserve to survive because they're more authentic. Like Heidegger still creates a hierarchical value system. Whereas when Gadamer's promoting humility, the way that you all were talking about that earlier, I really appreciated that as kind of Gadamer's unique differentiation from Heidegger.
Yeah, good. Don?
But if this takes us away from that and you want to say that, that's fine with me, but it just struck me that one of the odd things here, a stylistic feature, is simply that he asks an enormous number of questions.
Yeah.
Especially in the early part of the essay, there's just question after question after question, a whole series of questions. Okay. And even the opening sentence is death a question? And I think it's a question. Is it a question in either way? Is it a question for us that we ask? Does it ask us a question? And if it's not a question, what does that do? What challenge does that present to Gadamer's own emphasis on question and answer as the very core of dialogue? That the very core of understanding is question and answer. But is death something where we can't have a dialogue with death? We can't have a question and answer with death. So it seemed to me he was facing what is a very profound challenge to his own most fundamental thought here.
Yeah. That's a good point. Niall?
Yeah. I think just to answer that question, I think there's this knee-jerk reaction, which I understand why people need to separate philosophers out. But this idea of labeling humility to one and authenticity to the other, and then we have some breakthrough. I mean, what's your understanding of authenticity? Does it have to be some sort of decisionistic resoluteness? Because another way that you could read Heidegger is that the later word would be the Frömmigkeit des Denkens. It's a piety, it's a type of reflexivity. It has all the hallmarks of humility. It's just another word. So I don't know where humility takes us that authenticity doesn't. You mentioned hierarchical structure. Everyone for Heidegger has the capacity to be authentic.
I'm reading authenticity through Adorno's jargon of authenticity,
which is probably the worst text to read when it comes to understanding what Heidegger means by authenticity.
Maybe.
But I think the inroad that is made by Gadamer is that he sees there are certain structures and tendencies in the history of metaphysics, and he agrees with Heidegger on that. But he doesn't agree that there's such a thing as the language of metaphysics.
Right.
So he doesn't want to jump on Heidegger's term, the language of metaphysics. He says there is no such thing. So I think Gadamer could be seen as both resisting metaphysics from within the resources of metaphysics, maybe the untapped resources, rather than simply trying to think against it or think away from metaphysics. But apart from that, I don't think you could put like a piece of paper between their two accounts.
Wow.
I think, sorry, last point. This essay, it's much more culturally rich, I think, than Heidegger. It's much more literary rich, and he's bringing together so many interesting things in a way Heidegger wouldn't have done in an essay. So the style is different, but I think what they're after is the same target.
So what I would say is, and maybe I'm just wrong about this, is that Gadamer is more willing to draw on the philosophers of life for insights to solve these problems. Like he turns to Simmel and just credits him with the view that life is this self-transcendence. And then he uses that for his understanding of thinking. He builds on that, which strikes me as a different sense of thinking than Heidegger. It seems to me that that's something Gadamer is willing to go to, and Heidegger is going to say, no, we're not going to find the resources for answering these problems in a theory of life, an understanding of life. We need to have some sort of deeper, more existential, more phenomenological question analysis of Dasein. We can't simply stop at life and think that that's going to give us the kind of answers we want. But maybe I'm not appreciating where those ideas are in Heidegger.
David Vesey, I think you're right, and I think you helped answer Don's question about the question of death. But one interrupt, just Niall, I thought you were quite right saying much about the relation of Heidegger and Gadamer there, and that authenticity doesn't have to do with some higher state. It's about coming to oneself when the world closes itself off. But anyway, to say that David Vesey, I thought you were answering the question Don Marshall was asking about what about this question of death. In a way, the question about death, as you just said, to say it in very simple words, is about life-death, death-life. I'm playing on Derrida's new book of his lecture course that just came out. So that his question is not literally the question about death. It's about life-death. I don't want to say death in life. I just want to say you can't talk about the question of death without talking about life, and he's talking about these two.
Yeah, that makes sense. John, Arthos.
Yeah, I do want to agree that I think fundamentally he's aligning himself with Heidegger in terms of his argument, and especially as death relates to nothing and sort of the inexhaustibility of nothing and the ways in which human beings, it's because of death that human beings can understand life in the same way that a God cannot understand beauty, right? So, but the one thing I wanted to ask about is, the thing that I was missing here is that he at no time talks about death in terms of, say, for instance, the feeling of the loss of a child that a parent feels, right? Now, he does talk about the relationship of mother to child, and that's on page, oh, my numbers are wrong, but I'll just read what he says here. What about the ineradicable and seemingly natural expectation that what bound mother and child together in the early years, for example, cannot come to nothing, even through the certainty of death? So that seemed to me sort of like a Goethean moment, right, where he's acknowledging that bond cannot come to nothing. But although he puts that in the terms of a question, as Jim pointed out, so I guess I've introduced another theme in there.
Okay, thanks, John. As we think about these things, I want to, as an aside, I want to put in a plug for NASP, North American Society of Philosophical Hermeneutics, which is meeting this fall. We're going to try to meet in person in Michigan. Hopefully everything will be under control in Michigan by October, or everyone will be vaccinated or passed on by then. I'll put their call for papers is out. I'll put it up here in the chat. And our hope is to find a way, even if you can't make it in person, to have something online, because we do have a great international community of Gadamer scholars, and the more people who can participate in the conference any way you can, the better. So if you have things you'd like to submit or work on, or just come and we can finally meet in person and have a beer together, think about that in the fall. All right. The stall work. Don, go ahead.
Thank you. Well, I appreciated John Arthur's point about the death of a child, which is this is a short essay, and he has to speak in general terms. Yeah, but not all deaths are alike, and the experience of death is not the same with everyone who dies and all of the people related to me who die. The death of a child is very different from the death of a very aged parent, for instance, or a friend, and some differentiations seem appropriate there. And one that I mentioned to Eric, but it's sort of about his earlier point, has to do with that Celan poem. John Felsteiner, when he's interpreting that poem, objects to Gadamer's smooth transition from the us in that poem to we. That is, he wants to universalize the experience of aloneness recorded in the poem to all people dying. And Felsteiner is really saying, no, you can't do that. You really can't do that. This is not a poem about everybody. This is not a poem about all human beings. So I just wonder if there is, if you want to make a criticism of God, or one question to raise that has been raised is, does he universalize too smoothly? Does he use this we in a way too easily? I'm not sure. I think he does. But I'd be interested to know if people worry about that, or if they think sometimes he does and sometimes he doesn't, or what they think about the way he uses the we and sort of reaches these generalizations about them.
Yeah, I'll say, Don, that was my question about Gadamer's interpretation of Celan, because he says twice in the essays on the Celan poems, the Atemwende cycle, he says, I understand Celan, I understand this poem perfectly. So that was always my question about that. I mean, how is that possible, right? And especially with relation to Celan. So that's always been my question about that.
John Beach.
Yeah, I just wonder if when I read that poem by Celan, and I'm not an expert here at all in this regard, but I didn't think that Gadamer was necessarily endorsing that view of death. In fact, I think, and I think also, I hate to say this, but later when he mentions the horrible, or the suffocating it in itself and unable to move beyond itself, life extinguishes itself in suicide, which Celan did do. So I just, Celan may have been describing in a brilliant and truthful way his own experience that we can sort of understand, but it certainly was, I don't think it was something that Gadamer was incorporating into his own view here. And I just want, while I've got the floor, one more thing about comparing Gadamer and Heidegger. My point was that there is a difference, a big difference between Gadamer's interpretation of Plato and Heidegger's interpretation of Plato. But in the many, many times, and others here have been in person with Gadamer, I've heard him speak, and I've heard him pressed on what is the difference between you and Heidegger. He would become very, if he pressed too hard, he would not answer that question. And he did not say there is a he wouldn't do anything that globally or that sort of expansively, because there's so much of Heidegger that he learned from and that he endorses and he understands. I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, good. Thanks. So one thing I'm wondering, because we have some Ricoeur people with us, is this was first published in a Festschrift for Ricoeur. And I'm wondering if the people who know Ricoeur better than I do, when they read this, they think, oh yeah, this makes perfect sense. It was first given as a talk in Heidelberg to the students, but then it was published in a Ricoeur volume. That makes perfect sense that this would be, that Gadamer think, well, this is the paper I want for the Ricoeur Festschrift.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask, Roger about that in particular, because Ricoeur writes a lot about death towards the end, and he seems to have a much harder time with the prospect of death than Gadamer does. I mean, it's almost the opposite. Am I reading that wrong, Roger?
Well, I think this is why I asked sort of my follow-up question when John was talking about affirmation. I think this is a really interesting text. I'm going to actually go back to it and try to write my own little, I don't know. It's really worth spending some time, I think, especially when he's talking about freedom and, why the unthinkability of death is actually the condition for, I think I read it as that is an affirmation. But in terms of Ricoeur, I mean, in Time and Narrative, I believe it's at the end. I think it might be in volume 1 at the end of the chapter where he lays the 3rd chapter where he talks about mimesis and lays out his theory of mimesis. And if it's not there, it's somewhere in there. He asked the question: can we think of death and eternity together? So he's I think he has a critique, a kind of ongoing critique of Heidegger and the notion of being toward death, and so that idea of Stoic resoluteness. And there's some other place, and I could look it up, and I can't recall quite where it is, but he asks whether that sort of that existential understanding of Heidegger doesn't rely upon the existentiel, the testimony of the existentiel. So there's already a certain ethic, I think, for Ricoeur in the way that Heidegger talks about death and being towards death, that I think Ricoeur is in a sense critical of, because Ricoeur is trying to work out a kind of a primary affirmation, a moment of affirmation. And I think that's, for me, that's why this would be appropriate in a Festschrift for Ricoeur, because that, I think Jean has pointed this out already, that's really kind of for me, as I read it, that's the underlying thesis. That's what I think, when we can't think death, death finally is unthinkable for us. And the reason is that it's unthinkable is because we think. So I don't know if I'm really answering your question, but I think that that sort of theme of affirmation in here is very much in line with what Ricoeur was trying to work out in his hermeneutics.
I could just follow up on that. To me, the big difference, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but to me, the big difference is that Ricoeur really did think seriously about the possibility of an afterlife. In that sense, he was deeply and fundamentally Christian, right? Whereas Heidegger certainly wants to set that aside very early on, and Gadamer too. I'm reading them as not really interested in that question, but correct me if I'm wrong on
that's right. He was a Christian, and Ricoeur. Okay, and just stop me if I get rambling here too long. But I think Ricoeur, Ricoeur, and there's been lots of debate about this, whether Ricoeur was as ascetic as he claimed to be in separating, his religious convictions from his philosophy. I've actually I've tried to sort of go back at that in my recent book. I mean, not that I'm trying to advertise it here, but I mean, I did try to go back and sort of rethink that, and push it, I think, as hard as I could. I'll just, since we're all friends now, since you've invited me to be part of the group, I mean, originally when I set out, I mean, one of the questions I had was it a way to kind of sort of defend Ricoeur against that claim? And I sort of reworked that and went back to his philosophical anthropology. I think you could go back to things like Fallible Man and look at the anthropology. And I think this is maybe in the Gadamer essay too. I'd have to think about this some more. But that transcending intention, that's very much a part of the philosophical anthropology as he works it out in Fallible Man. And I think that whole idea of transcending is always holding out possibility. And I don't think that you have to necessarily make that theological. I mean, it lends itself to a theological interpretation, but philosophically, it's not de facto theological to claim that that's a creative moment, that there's always this transcendence within immanence. I mean, the other thing that Ricoeur points out in some of that early work is that every thinker of finitude is always a thinker of finitude and transcendence. You can't think finitude apart from transcendence. Now, but transcendence doesn't have to be metaphysical, and it doesn't have to be theological. It can always be transcendence within immanence, or transcending from within. And that's, you see that in exemplary acts, you see that in works, I mean, you see that in culture. And then you can link that up with what he talks about in the Aporias in terms of his critique of Hegel and the like. So, I mean, just a quick response, maybe not that quick to what John was saying, but
no, that helps.
I think it's important to make that distinction.
I appreciate that. That helps, Roger. So I have one other question, and it's been flaming up in the chat too. So this is and the question is, if death is fundamentally unintelligible, right? That is the core fact here. How does that affect the actual concrete choices many of us are going to make about our lives, about our end of life care, or about policies of end of life care? That's the sort of question you were asking, right, Nancy, about what it would be the connection between what Gadamer says here about death and certain policies about doctors helping patients in that process.
Mm-hmm. And certainly those are the questions that come up in palliative care all the time, right? I mean, death doesn't become the question in palliative care. It's about how we die, and the ways that we can honor people's wishes in that.
Yeah. Good. So do you think, oh, sorry, a question. Could I save the chat? Yes, I could try to save the chat. Yep. I'll do my best. At some point, we need to wrap this up and figure out what we're going to do next time in 2 months. It's April. It'll be mid-June, midsummer. Niall?
I wanted to just refer to the last 2 paragraphs of the essay, where I think he nicely, I don't think we've mentioned children, but he nicely refers to fairy tales as a way that we instruct children about that question of death. And I think that way of closing it is something you would definitely never see in Heidegger. He uses myth of Kura and all those things, but talking about a fairy tale in this way, I think, is quite unique to Gadamer. Because instead of facing up to anxiety as a form of thinking, I think a fairy tale puts a rhythm on anxiety, right? It kind of doesn't try to battle it or conquer it or flee from it, but something in the middle that it's putting a rhythmic structure on anxiety. The story helps us to carry the unintelligibility, to hold it in front of us, but not in the way that Heidegger might want us to do that. I think that might be just to come back to that question about how do we separate the two, I just liked the way he concludes with the fairy tale and how it helps our children and helps us, I guess, too.
Now, can you, the comment that you put in the chat about the dying with dignity and the candle, can you elaborate on that just a little bit? I just love that.
Because Nancy, I think it was really helpful what you said, because that really focuses the issue that it's not a question of death, it's the mode of one's dying. So do we facilitate others to have their end, not merely to perish or to perish invisibly, but to in some way, if that candle is flickering, there's a to and fro, and he says at the end, it seems to intensely burn towards the end. There's a particularity of the burn. So I then think care must in some way focus or prioritize how we hold that to and fro of the candlelight and keep it from becoming invisible to others, I suppose, right? That would be the task. What that means, how one would do it, how it's supported, they're very practical questions, but that would seem to be what needs to be the priority in the discussion. Yeah. And that's why I think this idea, and it comes back to the whole Gadamer seems to focus on this intensification of being, right? The whole intensification of being question could be connected to how we meet our end, or how we have our end, or how we experience that end. And the flickering of the candle and the particularity of the flickering at the end is in some way that Vollendung, he says, right? There's a full ending in that moment. So it's not a perfection, it's a full ending. So how can we have our full ending?
Yeah, Don.
Well, in that regard, he may have missed an opportunity to talk about a very famous topic, last words, deathbed scenes. So say David Hume dying. What did the manner of his death express? What did the words he spoke express? Or Henry David Thoreau or other people? Anyway, just.
He says somewhere, there is no last word, just as there is no first word.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. But John, I always thought that was in relation to dialogue, right? That the dialogue is always going. That it's not about there's no last word in the sense of one person can't have a final word before they die, but just that there is no end to the dialogue.
Right. Well, I mean, I think he's talking about it at both levels. Like he says, a baby does not, there's no first word, because what he's saying is that the baby's already talking before they say their first word, right? But he's also analogizing that to his greater theme, which is that, tradition is carrying on language beyond our subjectivity.
Yeah. All right, good. So I'm going to make some suggestions here in the chat of possible things we could do next. Let's send them around. Some of these I've mentioned before, we've talked about before. The first one is a recent translation, a very early radio talk, or, well, pre-Truth and Method radio talk from 1952. I thought, we could always look at a classic essay, like Aesthetics and Hermeneutics. We haven't talked much about aesthetics yet. I asked Arun and Paul's next volume is going to be Aesthetics. And I asked Arun if there's any pieces in there he thinks that are new and be interesting to read. And he sent me two about Goethe. One about Goethe and Mozart, and one about what makes Goethe's language natural. Goethe came up in our discussion today. So that's a possibility. And then from the talks in South Africa, we did the first one, but we didn't do the second one and the third one. I've started working on a translation of the third one. So that would be a possibility as well. Or there might be other suggestions if people have things they're really excited about or looking forward to working on. So what I could do is what I did the first time is send some suggestions out, and people can write back and say, boy, I'd really like to do this one. This one looks great. But are there others you want to add to this list? This would be your chance to put something else on the list and have it sent out as a possible discussion topic in June. Now's the time to speak up. Or put it in the chat.
Since we're getting some Recur folks coming here, the thing that I read over and over and over and over again is the debate between Gadamer and Recur that's in the Recur reader.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I was at that talk, incidentally, John.
Oh, I have to talk to you about that then.
That's SPEP.
Yeah. Well, that's always fun to hear. We'd get to hear the stories too, not just read the reading. Okay, I'll add that one to the list as well. Are there final questions, final things that are just gnawing at you that if we don't address them today, you will leave permanently dissatisfied with Gadamer and life? I don't want you to have that experience at the end of the day today. All those people who haven't had a chance to speak up, now's your chance. We'd love to hear from you. Final thoughts. Yes, John Beach, you get the last word.
Okay, I think I just recall Elton John's song "Candle in the Wind."
There we go.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, John. We can have that in your head now for the rest of the day. Thank you, everyone, for coming. This has been great. I really appreciate it. I really enjoy it. I'm already looking forward to June when we can do this again.
Thank you, David.
David, did you give us the link to the call for papers?
If not, I'll send it out. I thought I did. I thought I sent it to Nancy first, but then I thought I sent it to everyone, but I'll do it one more time.
I did put it in the chat.
Okay.
Yeah.
There it is, one more time. All right. Thanks, everyone.
How do you save the chat?
I don't know. I'll have to figure that out.